creedal statement of the Jesus movement was that Jesus is Lord. No New Testament writer reflects this brief Christological confession more than does the Apostle Paul. He applies the word Lord to Jesus nearly 230 times in his epistles, whereas he attaches the term Son of God to Jesus only 17 times. The Lordship of Jesus Christ is without a doubt the dominant theme in Pauline Christology. Paul, unlike other New Testament writers, applies the title Lord, Greek kurios, exclusively to Jesus in his corpus and thus never to the Father. For Paul, God is the Father and Jesus Christ is the Lord exclusively. We have already considered 1 Corinthians 8:4-6 as the most prominent Pauline passage that conveys this distinction. Another is where Paul writes to the Corinthians about the resurrection of the saints, saying, "Now God has not only raised the Lord, but will also raise us up." 1 Corinthians 6:14. Again, notice that Paul distinguishes God from Lord, the latter being Jesus. But what does it mean to call Jesus Lord? It means simply that Jesus ought to be obeyed regarding his instruction in righteousness. This is very interesting since Paul is the great proponent of the grace of God, even being falsely accused of antinomianism. Many traditionalists contend otherwise, alleging that the New Testament designation of Jesus as Lord indicates he is God due to the Septuagint practice of translating kurios for Yahweh. But Paul provides no evidence that his application for kurios to Jesus should be taken as a substitute for the tetragrammaton, as if implying that Jesus is Yahweh. J.D.G. Dunn says the word Lord in Paul's writing, kurios, is not so much a way of identifying Jesus with God, but if anything, more of a way of distinguishing Jesus from God. Besides, there is a consensus among authorities that first century Common Era copies of the Septuagint did not substitute words for tetragrammaton. In 1978, George Howard stated, "Recent discoveries in Egypt and the Judean desert show that pre-Christian Greek Bible and the tetragrammaton was never represented in the surrogate kurios and in addition was usually left untranslated. It was reproduced in archaic Hebrew or square Aramaic letters in the transliterated form of II Omega. The practice of surrogating the divine name in writing with kurios, as we find in the Christian copies of the Septuagint, is a Christian innovation that in no way reflects the appearance of the Bible which the New Testament writers used. The early church was accustomed to seeing the Hebrew word Yahweh written in the Greek Old Testament, not the surrogate kurios. In fact, Jewish copies of the Septuagint consistently replace kurios with the tetragrammaton. For many traditionalists, an important passage in this regard is Paul's renowned statement about salvation in Romans 10:9. It reads, "If you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved." These traditionalists think confessing Jesus as Lord implicitly affirms that he is God. On the contrary, Paul here juxtaposes Jesus and God, which actually distinguishes them. Calling someone Lord merely indicates either a respectful address or a submission to a monarch or master. The latter is meant whenever Jesus' disciples call him Lord. Even Oscar Coleman takes this traditionalist track. He asserts the question of the deity of Christ in the New Testament should be asked in terms of the Kyrios title and its implications for the absolute lordship of Christ over the whole world. The New Testament unquestionably presupposes the deity of Christ, but it does so in a connection with faith in the lordship he exercises. Thus, in connection with the Kyrios title, we could already speak of the occasional use in early Christian of the name God, Theos, for Jesus. For this name by no means indicates, as we are inclined to think, a higher dignity than the unsurpassable Kyrios designation. Gustav Dahlmann disagrees. He relates that, number one, Jesus and the early Jewish Christians of Palestine did not call God Lord in their languages, and number two, the Jews' substitution of the word Lord, Hebrew Adonai, for God's name Yahweh, had begun amongst Hellenistic Jews only. Dahlmann says in the New Testament Gospels, we do not find expressed the idea of God's becoming man or of a twofold nature united in a single person. James D.G. Dunn postulates that soon after Jesus' resurrection, the early Jewish Christians applied the title Lord to Jesus to indicate a divinity that was not fully God. Dunn further explains Paul calls Jesus Kyrios, but he seems to have marked reservations about actually calling Jesus God. Paul can hail Jesus as Lord not in order to identify him with God, but rather, if anything, to distinguish him from the one God. Paul calling Jesus Lord arouses the question of whether he worshipped Jesus. The question depends on how the word worship is defined. Dunn says Paul's writings should certainly make us hesitate before asserting that Paul worshipped Christ, since the evidence clearly indicates otherwise. Dunn further explains that if we make the historic distinction between certain words, for example, worship, veneration, and adoration, we could say that Jesus was worshipped, meaning that something short of the adoration reserved for God alone. In sum, the New Testament accounts of the early Christians calling Jesus Lord indicate no more than their recognition of his God-given authority to rule and their corresponding voluntary submission to be ruled by him. And Paul, the premier proponent of lordship Christology in the New Testament, gives no reason to venerate further by equating Lord with God.